I don't make a habit of looking at the obituaries in every morning's paper. However, I ran across one recently that I consider to be rather unique and interesting. And my guess is that many of you probably saw it too because it made its way through social media, and I found it on Facebook. Here it is for Kathleen Dimlow. She was born in March of 1938. She married Dennis Dimlow at St. Anne's in Wabasha. That's in Minnesota, by the way. Had two children, Gina and Jay. In 1962, she became pregnant by her husband's brother, Lyle Dimlow, moved to California. She abandoned her children, Gina and Jay, who were then raised by her parents in Clements. She passed away on May 31st of 18 in Springfield and will now face judgment. She'll not be missed by her Gina and Jay, and they understand that this world is a better place without her. Now, all I pray is that my family doesn't do that to me when I'm gone. I think that's worthy of a television network nighttime drama, don't you think? If my calculation's correct, Gina and Jay spent at least 56 years abandoned or feeling broken in the relationship with their mother and never came together before she died. Now, if we think about it, there are all sorts of stories that are very similar to that in terms of intrigue in our scriptures, both the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and in the New Testament. One of those stories is a story we're dealing with today of two brothers, Jacob and Esau. They are the grandsons of Abraham, if you're familiar with the line and the patronage line in Hebrew history. Of course, the covenant was with Abraham, first of all, passed on to Isaac, his son. And now Isaac's sons, these twin brothers, Esau and Jacob, are the center part of our story today. I had a professor of Old Testament at Perkins named Bill Power who loved this story, and he used to refer to Jacob and Esau as hairy and grabby. Now, there's a good reason for that. If you go back to the birth narrative in Genesis of these two, you'll notice that Esau, who was born first, it says that he was hairy and red. Therefore, calling him hairy was appropriate. And then it says that Jacob, who was born second, was grabbing a hold of the heels of his brother Esau as he was born. Hairy and grabby. And I guarantee you that the scenarios built behind Jacob and that particular name are quite appropriate. I want to share a couple of those in terms of the relationship between Jacob and Esau this morning that we find in Scripture. Jacob was quite a trickster. One day when Esau was out in the fields tending his flock, and it was very hot and dry, and he was hungry and was about ready to be famished, near death probably. Jacob was at home fixing a nice, scrumptious meal. We're told that it was probably soup of some kind, and the aroma was spreading throughout the tent. Here come Esau in from the field, and he smelled this food, and he wanted some of it. And so he approached his brother Jacob, and he said, I am really hungry, and I'm tired. Would you mind sharing some of this soup with me? And Jacob thought to himself, here's my chance. So he said to his older brother Esau, now you need to remember in Hebrew tradition, the elder son is the one that carries on the authority and heritage of the family. So Esau, firstborn, would have been that, right? So Jacob said to his brother Esau, okay, if you want some soup, you can have it, but you need to give me your birthright for it. Well, Esau thought to himself, I may not survive if I don't have this food. So what good is that birthright to me? So he gave Jacob his birthright. That's scenario number one in Genesis, the relationship between these two brothers. Sometime later, when Isaac, their father, was about to die, he called in Esau. Now again, the tradition is the elder son carries on the heritage of the family. He was going to give the blessing to Esau. Now Isaac couldn't see very much at all. He was almost blind. And he told Esau, he says, I want you to go out and to prepare one of your animals for a sumptuous meal. And once we've eaten that meal, I will give you the blessing before I die. So Esau leaves. He goes out and starts preparing the meal. Meantime, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, the mother of these two, heard the conversation between Isaac and Esau. She runs to Jacob, who is her favorite son, and she says to Jacob, I just heard that Esau is about to get your father's blessing. You need that blessing. And so she's the trickster here. She comes up with this plan of she's going to prepare the great meal for Isaac, who, now remember, he couldn't hardly see anything, right? She prepares the meal and tells her son Jacob, you need to go out into the field, find an animal, some animal skin, and put it on yourself, on your arms, on your legs, on your face, so that when you're approaching your father to gain the blessing from him, he will feel you and think that you are Esau, hairy. Okay? So there's the plan. And they perform, and Rebekah fixes the food, and Jacob goes out and finds the animal skins, and they approach Isaac. And Jacob comes under the guise of being Esau to his dad and asks for the blessing. Well, Isaac reaches out, starts feeling Jacob's arm. He says, well, you're hairy, but your voice does not sound like Esau. And yet, in the end, he did give him the family blessing. Well, not too long after that, here comes Esau, who was doing as his father asked him. He got the meal prepared. He was ready to receive the blessing, but he finds out that his brother had beat him to it, and you might guess it, he was angry. Now, Rebekah, again, Jacob, her favorite son, goes to Jacob and says, you know, I'm afraid for your life. Esau may want to kill you, so you need to leave. And so she asked him to go to her brother Laban back in Haran, which is the original homeland of Abraham and his family. So you go back there to Laban and tell him that you need to stay there for a while. So he does that. Now there's an interesting part of the story that happens there. You may be familiar with this. It involves two of Laban's daughters, one named Rachel and one named Leah. As Jacob met these two, these were his cousins, by the way, when he meets these two women, he becomes infatuated with Rachel, who in Genesis says she was very beautiful. Now the description of these two women is interesting. You know, we see that Rachel being a beautiful woman, and all it says about Leah, the older daughter, is that she had beautiful eyes. Now, I've heard descriptions like that of blind dates before, but that's what happens. She has beautiful eyes, and Rachel is beautiful. And Jacob wants Rachel. And so he goes to Laban, his uncle, and he says to Laban, I would like to marry Rachel, your younger daughter. And Laban says, well, you can do that, but you have to spend 7 years in labor here with me. So Jacob says, okay, I'll do that. So he spends 7 years. Then comes the wedding time. They prepare it, and I'm not going to go into all the details about the wedding, but what you find out is that it's not Rachel that he gets. He ends up with Leah. Now, Jacob was not very pleased about this, and he went to his uncle and he said, you tricked me. And this is a trickster saying that, right? Says to Laban, you tricked me, and I want Rachel. I don't really want Leah. But Laban says to him, well, what do you expect? She's the older daughter. I've got to give her away first before I can give Rachel away. So here's the deal. You spend 7 more years working for me here. You can have Rachel too. So Jacob agrees, and he does spend 7 more years there. And after that, he ends up with 2 wives, Leah and Rachel. Now, here comes the important story for our offerings and reconciliation today. Remember all that Jacob had done to his brother Esau. Somehow he feels the call of God to go back to Canaan, where his brother is living, and to try to rectify the situation, to find reconciliation with his brother. So he picks up his livestock, which he made a deal with Laban to take, and with his 2 wives and his family, and he heads back to Canaan. Now, before he meets Esau, try to create an image in your mind, because I think this is what was going on. There was a valley in which he sees Esau and his 400 men coming towards him to meet him. And you might guess that he had a certain sense of fear about what might happen with that entourage coming. And he goes to the top of an area called Jabbok. I think it's a mountain. It's a large area high above, so he can see the valley below. And he tells a large part of his family to go ahead and meet Esau, and he would come down later. He spends the night on Jabbok, and as the story says, he wrestled with a man. Now later on we come to understand that that's really God he's wrestling with, where he says, I have striven with God and survived. So here he is in a wrestling match with God, asking God for a blessing. You see, he's seeking some kind of divine intervention into his meeting of his brother Esau. He asks for a blessing from God, never really receives it in this particular story. What he does get is a change of name. God says to him, you are no longer called Jacob, you are Israel. So now you see the purpose of this story. You find out how Jacob, instead of Esau, becomes the patriarch of the nation of Israel. So he receives this name change, and he also receives a broken or a damaged hip or thigh. Now that to me is imagery to say that he will kind of live in a certain way with his guilt and shame that he did towards his brother, that God has given us as a reminder of that. So now he has this physical ailment, heads down towards the valley to meet his brother. And remember, he's already sent some of his entourage ahead. And this is where I want to pick up what we find in the 33rd chapter of Genesis, the first 11 verses. The two brothers meet each other. Now Jacob looked up and he saw Esau coming and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. He put the maids with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on ahead of them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him, and he embraced him, and he fell on his neck, and he kissed him, and they wept. When Esau looked up and saw the women and children, he said, who are these with you? Jacob said, the children whom God graciously has given your servant. Then the maids drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down, and finally Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, what do you mean by all the company that I met? Jacob answered, to find favor with you, Lord. But Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. Jacob said, no, please, if I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand. For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God, since you have received me with such favor. Please accept my gift that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have everything I want. So he urged him to take it. Wow, that's a powerful text. Jacob looking into his brother's eyes, whom he had deceived many times. And he says, seeing your face and the grace and forgiveness I see there is like seeing the face of God. Now, I think reconciliation is a two-sided coin. And you see that in the story of Jacob having to wrestle with God and the divine relationship on Jabbok before he goes to find reconciliation in a human form with his brother Esau. I think both of those are important, at least in terms of scriptures that we have. There is a sense in which we have to be fulfilled in both of those relationships before we can move ahead. There's a text in Matthew, if you want to put it up there, which is intriguing to me. It says, so when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before you go to the altar. That's Matthew 5:23 and 24. Now, many years ago, as I was first reading that particular text, you can leave it up there, please. As I was reading that particular text, I didn't see anything wrong with that. I thought, well, that's pretty easy. I know who I have violated and broken relationships with. I'll simply go to them and I'll offer forgiveness from them from my perspective. But that's not what that says. It says to go find those who have something against you and to reconcile with your brothers and sisters. Then come back to the altar before God. I think the text is about the two-sided nature of reconciliation, that both are necessary. The human brother to sister, forgiveness and grace, also that we need the grace of God to move forward. A couple of weeks ago, I ran across a movie based on a song that I've known for quite some time, called I Can Only Imagine. It's a story about a young man, Bart Millard is his name. He lives in Greenville, Texas, actually, or grew up there. And the story is about his, shall we say, non-relationship with his father, who was abusive emotionally and physically towards him. The story, the movie begins when he's about 10 years old, and his mother takes him to a camp. And when he's done with the camp and comes back home, what he finds is a moving van there picking up all of his mother's things, and she's gone. So now he has to live in a house of an abusive father whom he has a very, very difficult time relating to and trying to find some way to survive. Well, one way he tries to survive is to do what he thinks his father really likes. And he says, my father likes one thing only, and that's football. So he begins to play football in the high school team. His father pushes him and pushes him hard and shames him to try harder. And in the process, he breaks both ankles and therefore can't play football anymore. Now he was left in a high school curriculum without football. The credits there, had to find some way to supplant those. And he goes to the Glee Club because that was the only available course. And he goes to the teacher of the Glee Club and says to her, can I join you? There's an opening here in this class and I need it to graduate. And she says to him, well, can you sing? No, I can't sing, he says. And here he is in a wheelchair, and he says, well, I like technology. He says, I can do technology. He says, okay, I need an assisted tech person, so you can do that. Well, one day, as he was working in an auditorium, preparing the technology for a concert, I assume, she hears him singing. Beautiful voice. And so without his knowledge, she puts him in the play, the school play. It was the musical Oklahoma. She put him in the main role of Curly. And of course, he didn't like that. But it was the beginning of a career in music for him. Now, when he graduated from high school, it was his opportunity to get away. He leaves Greenville, and he goes to the city, and he joins this musical group, which later becomes Mercy Me. And they struggled with creating music and trying to find people to accept it, to gain an audience, if you will, nationwide. It just didn't work. And his manager, who was a very supportive man, told him, says, I think that you're going to have to reconcile that relationship with your father because down deep it's bothering you. You can't get beyond that. Your music does not speak of who you are. You need to go back and reconcile with your father. And so finally he decides to do that. Much to his own dismay, he goes back to the house, and I'm going to show you a video clip from I Can Only Imagine, where he comes home to his father who had abused him for years, and he is trying to seek some form of reconciliation. But I can't. Maybe some of us have been in that kind of a situation where we're trying to find some sort of reconciliation, but it's very difficult to do. Arthur, the father, had tried to make his way back to find forgiveness and grace in God, a God who always has grace and forgiveness for each and every one of us. He was working towards that and was having a more difficult time with his son, Bart, who could not forgive him. Again, forgiveness and reconciliation is a two-sided coin here. It wasn't until Bart walked out of the house and got into his dad's pickup and was going to leave the premise and was searching for the key, pulled down the visor, and he found a letter there. It was from his doctor, his dad's doctor, who said that he was dying of terminal pancreatic cancer. That was the transformation in their relationship. And later on in the film, we hear Bart say, I saw God at work transforming the life of my father. I know that God is in the midst of reconciling relationships. Now, being a third party in terms of reconciling relationships is a very difficult thing. I personally have experienced that. Maybe you have as well. Back when I was dean of students at Kansas Wesleyan University, a couple of young women who were students of mine and good friends, they got angry with one another. I'm not even sure what it was all about. And I'm not sure they know what it was all about either. But I'm sure you've been in a situation where two of your friends are arguing and their relationship becomes broken. It just hurts you down deep. You want to do something about it. Well, I tried. It just didn't work. And I still communicate with each of them individually today. You know what? They don't talk to each other still today. There is an example, at least one that I'm aware of in Philippians, if you'll throw that up on the screen, where Paul is talking to his church in Philippi about two women, Euodia and Syntyche, who are at each other's throat. Paul says, I urge Euodia and Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you also, the congregation, my loyal companion, to help these women. So there is some sense in the scriptures that says we have a responsibility of helping reconciliation to occur. Seems to me that it's pretty clear that God does desire reconciliation. If you look at our scripture texts, both Old and New Testaments, it's all about God and reconciliation. I mean, one of the creation stories is about Adam and Eve, God's creation, who create a distrust between them and their Creator because they disobey God and eat of the forbidden fruit, and they hide from God. And from that particular story, we see Old Testament stories where God is trying to mend that relationship between God and God's creation. For example, you see the story about Israel going to Egypt and spend 400 years there in slavery. And God then finds Moses and sends him there to bring them out of slavery and take them to the promised land, across the wilderness for 40 years. Then you have the story about the prophets who are constantly trying to talk to the people of Israel and tell them what God expects and what they should and should not do and how they disobey even what the prophets say. And then there's the exile in Babylon, the disobedient people who finally then are coming back home to their promised land in Canaan. New Testament's all about God's reconciling efforts as well, where God chooses to come in human form to this person we call Jesus Christ and offers grace and reconciliation to the people of Galilee and beyond, and to us as well. But even Jesus was crucified, rejected on a cross. But that didn't stop God. God's grace was still there in terms of a resurrection, a new life that is offered to each and every one of us. The biblical witness, the biblical history is all about reconciliation from the beginning to the end. God's love and God's call for each one of us to reconcile our relationships with our brothers and sisters, with each other. We call that prevenient grace in the Wesleyan tradition. And whether we acknowledge it, whether we even know it, that God is calling us to forgiveness and to grace. You remember the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to Peter after Peter had denied Jesus 3 different times? Jesus asks him questions, 3 of them, but they're the same question. Do you love me? And Peter says, of course, Lord, I love you. Jesus says, well, go feed my sheep. Again, he says, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, of course, Lord, I love you. And he says, well, go feed my sheep. And the 3rd time he says, do you love me? And Peter says, well, yes, Lord, I love you. Well, then go feed my sheep. The love of God through Jesus Christ, the divine love, and the commandment to go and feed my sheep or to love my brother and sister. Let them know the grace of God as well. Reconciled relationships involves both God and us, each other. I want to go back to that song that the movie is titled for, I Can Only Imagine. At the end of it, Bart and his dad do come together. Their relationship is mended. And it led to a song which became the most popular Christian song ever, called I Can Only Imagine. I would imagine some of you have heard it, maybe not paid a lot of attention to the words, but I want you to listen very closely now as I play the last video clip from that movie, which is Bart singing that song, I Can Only Imagine. Hear those words anew.